My name is Richard Branson. I work in a small factory as a handyman. This is not the life I once dreamed of, but what to do? I have no other option. My hands, tired and covered with traces of labor, touch metal parts every day, which bring me neither pride nor joy. I don't have any special qualifications, but it doesn't matter. The important thing is that I chose to work right after graduating from high school. Being honest and working is all I can afford. The salary is small, and dreams of a better life seem so far away that sometimes they turn into an empty illusion. I rarely have more than $300 billion in my wallet, and about $800 in my bank account. To be honest, I stopped paying attention to the numbers a long time ago. I'm doing fine. One day I was walking home from work when I noticed her. She was sitting on a bench by the sidewalk. She looked strange. She seemed to be wearing a school uniform, but there was not a drop of school discipline in her outfit. She looked kind of rude, carefree, but desperate at the same time. She was not wearing a coat, and her knees were covered with scratches, as if she was trying to escape from something. I could have sworn there was fear in her eyes. Evening was already approaching, and a cold wind was rising, making her literally freeze on the spot. She kept rubbing her hands, trying to keep warm. I didn't know what was wrong with her, but I saw that she needed help. She definitely wasn't going home. She couldn't have been from this area. I couldn't just walk by. A thought immediately popped into my head. What if I left her alone? I didn't want anything to happen to her. I hurried to the nearest coffee shop, bought hot tea with lemon and donuts, and returned to the girl. She looked scared, as if I was a threat to her. I sat down next to him and quietly said, "Hey, good evening, don't be afraid, I won't hurt you. You look cold, so I brought you something warm. Do you want this?" I handed her a cup of tea, and she took it gratefully, pressing it to her cheek, as if she couldn't feel her body, but could feel the warmth. I continued, "Aren't you hungry? You're only getting worse from hunger. Don't you want to eat something?" She looked at me with a slight confusion, but realized that I was not expecting answers. She took a donut and thanked me in a low voice. Then she asked, "Aren't you going home?" I didn't know how to answer. I was wondering what was wrong with her, but I didn't want to invade her personal space. She shook her head, but didn't say anything, and I sensed that she was hiding something. I noticed that her skirt was fluttering in the wind, and I saw her legs. They were covered with painful wounds. It was too obvious to ignore. I couldn't understand what could have hurt her so much. I asked who did this to her, and she froze, pulling down her skirt to hide her injuries. My doubts began to grow. "Who offended you?" I asked. She tensed, and her face turned stony. I realized that I had no right to insist, and decided that I would not ask any more questions. Instead, he suggested, "Listen, you'd better go home." "Don't you want to go home?" She lowered her head and said softly, "No. I thought about going to my father, but it's too far." Her words were filled with longing, and I felt that this situation was much more complicated than just a frozen teenager. I wrote down the phone number I found for this address and handed it to the girl. She was relieved to take the piece of paper, which contained the name and number of the company, as well as an address where she might be able to find her father. I told her, "Here's the number, call me tomorrow, you'll probably be able to find out where it is. It's the Greenwood UK Group, a construction company, so your father probably works there. I hope you can see him." The girl smiled slightly, although her eyes were still full of anxiety. I added, "You should stay at a nearby hotel tonight, I'll book a room for you. You can stay alone, right?" She nodded, but then looked doubtful again. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. "I'm not rich either, but I have some," I replied, opening my wallet. There was only one $300 bill in it. I figured that would be enough for at least one night. "Don't worry, I can cover your expenses for one night. After a warm bath and a good night's sleep, you can call your father. I hope you find him. But I won't be able to repay you," I continued, trying to calm her down. She looked at me gratefully, but I sensed that she was still worried. We went to the hotel, where I had already booked a room in advance. $300 was a small amount, but it was a real salvation for her. At the hotel, I talked to the staff, explained the situation, and handed them the money. I asked them to help her make a phone call so she could contact her father. In the morning, when she wakes up, let her call. After that, I said goodbye to her, feeling a certain heaviness in my chest. I left knowing that I had done everything I could. However, the money in my wallet was exhausted, and I had to return to my daily life. A few days later, my director, Mr. John, unexpectedly called me at work. "Did you call me?" His voice was dry, and I felt strangely uneasy. I've never been called to my office. When I walked in, my nerves were on edge. Mr. John was dressed in an expensive suit, and his appearance seemed out of place for the manager of a small factory. "Richard Branson?" he asked, looking at me. I answered in the affirmative, not yet understanding what was going on. "You don't have to come here anymore," he said, as if it was natural. My eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" I asked, not understanding what he was talking about. He said without any explanation that my father was fired. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to find the words to say something, but they wouldn't come. He added, "Pack up and leave, we don't need people like you." I stood at a complete loss, trying to figure out what was going on. "I'm sorry, but may I ask why?" I asked in disbelief. He replied coldly, "We don't need troublemakers, and you're one of them." I felt anger boiling inside me, but I kept myself in check. "What do you mean? How am I disturbing the peace?" For a moment I thought it was some kind of mistake. His response was even more stunning. "We can't work with someone like you who happens to be connected to the mafia." I was numb. Does he really think that I am somehow involved in criminal matters? "That's not true," I cried out, unable to believe that I was being accused of something like this. "I'm not affiliated with the mafia. I don't understand what you're talking about at all." But he was adamant. "You're not lying, but we're not going to work with people like you," he said, ignoring my words. I tried to convince him that it was a misunderstanding, but he wasn't listening anymore. He ended the conversation like this: "Next time you apply, don't lie." That was his last response, and I couldn't believe what had just happened. "Please, Mr. John, I'm telling you the truth." I stood in front of him, tormented in my soul, trying to find words that could change his mind, but he was no longer listening. There was only a cold indifference in his eyes, and his gesture was as if I was an empty place, not worthy of attention. "Just go away," he said, pointing to the door. "I told the office to pay you for today. You are no longer needed in our company. Don't come back here." His voice was icy, and I felt my insides tighten. I kept insisting, "This is a mistake, there must be some mistake, But he just spread his hands, expressing complete indifference. "You've already made your point, that's enough, now get out." "I have a job," he said, without even giving me a chance to explain myself. There was something definitive in his eyes, as if there was no point in continuing the conversation. Realizing that it was useless to argue, I took the envelope with the last salary, hardly believing that this was all. A thin, lifeless envelope, which hid the entire reward for 13 years of work, strenuous efforts, and days spent in the factory hall. Was it really all worth this one dreary piece of paper? I stood there feeling drained, but I knew I had to move on. Saying goodbye to my colleagues, I noticed how they expressed regret, but at the same time, they all knew that if they stood up for me, they would face the same fate. They were all silent when I left. There was not only sympathy in their eyes, but also fear, the fear that tomorrow they might be in my place. I left the factory with my head down. I realized that now I had to face reality. All I had was this one envelope, and its contents would barely last a couple of weeks. Where can I find a job now? How much time do I have? I was at a loss. I dreamed of finding a new job as soon as possible, but only disturbing thoughts were spinning in my head. Immersed in these thoughts, I suddenly noticed a black luxury car nearby. Why is she staying here? Someone important, maybe someone connected to the factory, Maybe some important event is waiting for me? My thoughts were interrupted when the driver in gloves got out of the car and opened the back door. A man in an expensive suit got out of the car, followed by a girl. The man looked at her and asked, "Is that the guy?" She nodded. At that moment, I recognized her. It was the same girl I had talked to a few days ago. I couldn't believe my eyes. "Oh, you really met your father. That's wonderful," I exclaimed, forgetting my problems for a moment. She turned to me and her face lit up with a bright smile. "Yes, I was able to find him. Thank you very much," she said, hugging me. At that moment, her father, who was standing next to me, also looked at me. "Thanks to you, my daughter was able to get to me safely." "Thank you very much," he said with sincere gratitude. I was happy for her, glad that her search had ended so successfully, but at the same time, questions were ringing in my head. How am I supposed to live now? The man looked at me and then asked curiously, "Are you leaving the company so early? Do you have a place to be?" I didn't know how to answer. My lips barely moved, trying to come up with something normal. "Oh, yes, something like that," I managed with a forced laugh. Everything was raging inside me, but I couldn't tell someone I just met that I'd just been fired. I couldn't entrust my pain to a stranger, especially someone like him, a man who clearly held an important position. He looked at me again, and his face softened. "If you're not in a hurry, maybe you'd like to join me for lunch," he suggested. I was stunned. "No, thanks," I replied, feeling embarrassed. "It's too much. I can't accept your gratitude for doing what I thought was right." But he didn't insist, just smiled gently. "Don't act like that. Of course, if you have other plans, I won't insist. But if you're free, join me. I wouldn't want to let you go without thanking you properly." His voice was low but insistent. "After all, you helped my daughter, and a simple thank you doesn't seem enough," he continued, almost apologetically, as if his words couldn't fully convey all the gratitude he felt. I stared at him, not knowing what to say. We were both in a difficult situation, but his words somehow touched me, as if he really appreciated my action, despite his high position. At first I refused, not knowing what else to say, and not even knowing what to do. I had just been fired, had no job, and no clear future. The sadness in my heart covered me completely, and it seemed that finding a new job in this state would not bring success. All I could afford was to think about the next step, but the same fear of failure plagued me. So I just stared at him, trying not to show my confusion. "Well, if you insist, I'll join you," I finally said, deciding not to refuse. Maybe it won't change my fate, but at least for a while it would allow me to forget. We got into his car and he drove me to a restaurant that I could hardly afford even in the best days of my career. I felt a little awkward looking at myself. In my old work clothes, I clearly stood out from the rest, but the man just smiled. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Clothes don't matter here." And indeed, when we entered the restaurant, I realized that I was in a completely different world. The local housewives greeted us with special respect, showing no dissatisfaction with the fact that I was not in a suit, but in an old work jumpsuit. Everything in this place screamed luxury, from the casually smiling waitresses to the gold mirrors and carved wooden panels on the walls. The atmosphere was extremely pleasant, but at the same time alien. I felt like an alien in this world. When the food finally appeared on the table, I forgot about everything. The taste of each dish was so exquisite that I could hardly believe it was possible. The wine, juicy steaks, and desserts were all truly luxurious. The warm conversation with his daughter, her sincere smile, and the kind words of my father warmed me. It was something I hadn't felt for a long time, just joy, without heaviness in my chest. At some point, the man handed me a business card. "I should have introduced myself at the beginning," he said. I took the card and read it. "Greenwood, the Greenwood family, United Kingdom." "Oh, my God," I blurted out. "The mafia?" "Yes, you're right," he said with a slight, almost ironic expression. "But that's not exactly true. I would not say that we are doing anything illegal. In the end, thanks to you, I was able to reunite with my daughter, and I am very grateful for that." I was shocked, and it didn't escape his attention. He continued, "My daughter has not been with me for many years. Her mother and I divorced many years ago, and after that she soon married someone else. His new husband became the vice president of a small factory, but after her mother died, her new wife moved in with the president of the company. He was a kind man, but when the president passed away, the situation changed. My ex-wife's daughter was left alone, and she was treated badly. I noticed bruises on my legs," he continued. "But that wasn't all. She suffered much more, especially in places where no one could see. It was terrible. Her mother had given her an amulet once, and there was a note with my address in it. That was the end of it, without a phone number, without anything. She tried to find me, but it was hard. She was a schoolgirl, walked for many kilometers, and if it wasn't for me, she might just freeze. It was a difficult period for her." I listened carefully, trying not to interrupt. The man continued, "I swore to take revenge on the one who hurt her. It doesn't sound good, let's just say, from a person who is in our family. But I understand your reaction." I nodded, deeply feeling what he had told me. But I continued to be tormented by the thought of why he could so easily be with us at this moment. There are too many coincidences. "But I've actually just been fired," I said, feeling the words come out of me without giving me time to think. My voice sounded even, almost detached, but everything was bubbling inside. He raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. "Fired? Why? What is it?" he asked, and there was genuine interest in his voice. His reaction puzzled me a little, because I expected something different, something more detached, perhaps, in response to such a personal problem. Wrongfully accused of having links with antisocial forces. I have no idea how this happened. This morning, out of the blue, they told me about it, and then they fired me, I continued, feeling the bitterness return with each uttered phrase. The feeling of powerlessness was covering me more and more. He was silent for a few seconds, but he seemed to be thinking about something. Then he quickly got up and, calling someone, continued the conversation with the head, who was standing next to him. I couldn't hear the words out loud, but judging by his gestures and the way he gripped the phone tightly, it was clear that the conversation was important. When he returned, his face was tense and there was a slight smile on his lips, but it did not hide the depth of his thoughts. "Idiots," he breathed, clearly annoyed. "I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. It's probably my boyfriend's fault." He explained everything with such a light tone that I felt awkward, as if I had no right to be a part of his world. "You mean?" I started to ask, but he quickly nodded in confirmation. "I asked my people to check on you. They found out where you worked, but they wanted to make sure you were really there. It looks like they mentioned the name of our organization on the phone, and it probably got through to your boss. That's what led to your dismissal," he said, rubbing his forehead. I felt how hard it was for him to talk about it. "I'm sorry, I'll fix it," he continued. "Talk to the manager tomorrow, explain the misunderstanding, and everything should be fine." "No, it's okay," I replied, although inside everything was far from calm. "Actually, it's not all right. You must have problems, right?" I asked, looking into his eyes. I didn't want to be naive, but his suggestion to sort out the situation sounded too simple. He nodded, his gaze dimmed a little, and I realized that he didn't want to talk about it. "Yes, it's true that I'm in a difficult situation," he admitted. "But if I go back to work under that manager, it will be the same old problem. I don't want to work for someone like him." "And you? Do you have another job in line?" His question caught me off guard. I was thinking a little bit. "I don't have anything," I said, deciding not to hide the truth. "To be honest, if I don't find something by the end of the month, I'll have to choose something completely different from what I want. But I still want to stand on my own 2 feet and find a job on my own." He was silent, then looked at me curiously, but there was no condemnation in his eyes. "Good for you," he said. "In that case, how about I introduce you to the company my friend runs? They are not affiliated with the mafia or anything like that. I think my friend would like to help you. I felt a little tempted, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was wrong here. It was all too sudden and too close to a world I didn't want to be in. No, it's okay, I replied, resisting the temptation. Although I would really like to accept your offer, I'm not sure I can trust it, knowing that you're connected to the mafia. He smiled, his gaze almost peaceful. Well, if you ever need help, just call the number on my business card. I'm always here for you, he said with a warmth I didn't expect from someone involved in such dark matters. A month has passed, and, as I feared, the job search has not been successful. I started to think that I would have to accept a part-time job, but one evening he called me. His voice was strangely cheerful, even cheerful. I'm in, he said. I'm in the mood for a drink, but I don't have anyone. Could you keep me company? I thought about it for a while, then decided to accept his invitation. It was a chance to break the deadlock I found myself in. Justice, he began, and his voice sounded like a quiet but powerful growl hidden under the thickness of a peaceful conversation. Over the past month, I have been finding out who did these terrible things to my daughter. It turned out that it was the same manager of the company you worked for. I felt everything inside me tense up. He talked about it so calmly, as if he wasn't making a confession about someone's life, about someone's pain, about a crime that could turn everything around. He was the manager, he continued. But the previous manager, he wore work clothes and helped in factory workshops. This guy wears expensive suits and never shows up at the factory. He lives in a luxury neighborhood, an hour away by car, and that's why he's always late. He's a typical executive who doesn't care about the workers. My daughter was his maid, and it seems she wasn't even properly fed. She cried after eating just one bagel. Really, it's terrible. I couldn't believe that someone could be so ruthless. My jaw trembled slightly as I tried to comprehend the cruelty of what was happening. He was finishing his beer, as if trying to get rid of something inside himself. Yes, it's true, I said, unable to hide my shock. Really, I can't believe that he could treat my daughter like that. That's exactly what I want to fix, he said, looking into her eyes with determination. I need your help. I want to avenge my daughter, but I don't plan on doing anything illegal. I don't want to end up in jail and miss time with her. I want to do it legally. Legally? I repeated, raising my eyebrows in surprise. I wonder how. Without losing confidence, he continued. I started a company. Although she works in the same industry, it doesn't matter. I'm not looking for anything more. I just want to take over the management of this company. We'll take her in and get rid of this manager. I have all the evidence against him. I felt my heart tighten. It seemed that this decision had been thought out to the smallest detail. He has a lot of debts, he continued. Mostly because of gambling and stuff like that. Now he's using the company's money to pay off those debts. His methods are so dirty that you won't even believe it. Really? I asked, not hiding my surprise. He nodded, and I felt the tension in the room grow. Yes, and that's why the salaries of employees are so low, he continued. They fell a lot after the death of the previous manager. It's a diagram, I said, understanding what he was talking about. They all worked to cover his debts. He nodded again. I want to kick him out of the company. Make it a place where people will earn what they deserve. I was silent, digesting the information. I understood that now everything was on the verge. And what will happen to him if he gets kicked out? I asked, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. He's going to be in big trouble, he said, looking me straight in the eye. His wife only married him for his money. If she finds out that he is no longer president, she will most likely leave him. And I will make sure that no company hires him anymore. I was amazed by his confidence. How could he keep everything under control like that? Can you do that? I asked. He grinned, almost proudly. I'm Greenwood's boss. I can easily handle such things. But why are you asking for my help? I asked, not understanding why he needed me if he could decide everything on his own. He replied calmly, "Because you were also a victim of his actions. I thought maybe you'd want revenge. I'm sure all employees will feel the same way when they find out." I cringed inside, realizing that his plan was much more ambitious than I had imagined. If everything goes as it should, I plan to expand the factory, make it even bigger. "I want to make you a manager," he said, and there was a promise in his voice that I never expected. "The manager?" I asked, not believing my ears. "But I'm just a high school graduate, it's impossible." "What are you talking about?" He replied. "In the past, high school graduates often became presidents. If you don't have an education, you make up for it with experience and hard work. I believe you can handle it. If you become a manager, I can trust you. The factory will be in good hands." That was the moment when everything started to change. My perception of the world, my understanding of what is possible and what is not, it's all turned upside down. "I understand," I said, and there was a determination in my voice that I hadn't expected from myself. "Count me in." I agreed, I said, and this simple phrase seemed more important at that moment than ever before. "Okay, then tonight we'll drink to the future of the new company," he said, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. So I suddenly found myself involved in a plan to take over the factory, which eventually became the reason for my dismissal. 2 months have passed, filled with careful planning, strategy, and stealthy maneuvers. My colleagues and I explored every detail, every corner of the factory and the life of its manager, thinking through every step. Everything was ready, and our plan to financially destroy the factory through a takeover was on the verge of implementation. One day, after a while, I had to meet Mr. John, a man I hadn't seen for a long time. When we met, he was somewhat puzzled, as if he was trying to remember something important, but could not. "We've met before, haven't we?" "What is it?" he asked, frowning. I smiled, realizing that the conversation was gaining momentum. "Yes, we've met," I replied, trying not to show the slightest emotion. "You probably don't remember me. I am Richard Branson, the same high school graduate who was fired on false charges of mafia ties." His eyes widened in surprise, and he fell silent, trying to make sense of what I said. "Did Greenwood check on you?" "What is it?" he asked in disbelief. "Yes," I replied. "He used it as an excuse to fire me. I'm just a high school senior, and it seems like it was enough for him to get rid of me. But as you can see, I found a good job at another company, and now I have no hard feelings. On the contrary, I came to you with an offer." He raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued. "What's the offer?" "What is it?" he asked, his face reflecting curiosity. I took the contract out of the folder and put it on the table in front of him. "I want to offer you an $8 million contract," I said, not hiding my confidence. He was left in complete amazement. $8 million? He repeated in perplexity. "Are you sure? In that case, I have to understand what you want in return." I explained to him that I want them to deliver a certain amount of products within 3 weeks, and as soon as the delivery is confirmed, the money will be transferred. "I would like you to deliver this amount of goods," I said, "and as soon as the delivery is completed, we will transfer you $8 million. He couldn't hide his delight, and I realized that he was ready to sign the contract without further thought. Of course," he exclaimed without even reading the details. "That sounds great. I'm signing it." I couldn't help but smile as I watched how easily he was led into such a deal. Of course, I knew that his administrative skills were very questionable, and this was confirmed once again when he signed the contract without checking it, without going into its details. After a while, the product was produced, but when the time came for delivery, problems began. No transportation company agreed to fulfill the order, and I realized that Greenwood had invested his money in solving this issue. In desperation, Mr. John himself went to look for a carrier, but when the truck arrived, it turned out that it was a transport belonging to Greenwood's people. Hundreds of goods were loaded onto dozens of trucks, but along the way, All of them, as if by magic, stopped due to a malfunction of the vehicles. And so one by one, before the goods were not delivered. "We're running out of time," I said, contacting him. "The goods have not arrived." He returned to the factory, out of breath with excitement. "This contract is a violation. We have suffered huge losses," he declared with desperation in his voice. "No," I replied, "we shipped everything as agreed. You just don't understand that the contract clearly states that if the goods are not delivered on time, you will pay $8 million. He was looking at me, clearly not understanding what was going on. "It's impossible," he stammered. "My company doesn't have that kind of money. There is no $8 million. "Then we have no other choice," I said coolly. "We'll have to take over this factory." "Calm down," I said, restrained and confident. "Take over the factory, it is also specified in the contract." His voice trembled as he gasped. Are you serious?" "But, even if the delivery failure was caused by the carrier, your company is still responsible. You signed the contract." I reminded him that I was holding the document in my hands, and that his words would lose their force before this proof. "You signed the contract," I repeated with cold determination. "You haven't even read it in full, and now reap the fruits of your indifference." He was stunned into silence. His face turned pale, his eyes darted around the room in search of salvation. "But wait," he began, realizing that the situation was getting out of control. "I didn't understand what I was signing. The loss of the factory will destroy everything. This is the end." "It's not the end," I said, unmoved by his despair. "It's just the beginning of a new path. Without the factory, no one will cover your personal debts." He looked at me in horror, his voice breaking as he asked, "How do you know about my debt?" "We did our homework," I replied, continuing, "You knew what you were doing. Moreover, your wife will most likely leave you too. She only married you for your money. It's not a secret." His face paled and he fell silent, realizing the gravity of the situation. His eyes filled with panic as he realized that everything he had built was crumbling. "I'm not the only one mad at you," I continued. "Now the factory belongs to our company. Pack your things and leave." He sat down on a chair, in utter despair, with his head in his hands. His shoulders were shaking with hopelessness. "This is unbelievable," he said, his voice full of bitterness and disappointment. "What am I going to do with this debt? How will I survive this?" After he left the factory, John returned home to his wife, hoping that she would be able to help him, as she once did. He begged her for support, but as expected, his life was important to her only when he was successful and rich. His wife greeted him coldly, with an indifference that amazed him even more. Enjoying a luxurious life, she could no longer be by his side when he was on the verge of ruin. "You should have thought of this earlier," she said, wiping away tears that he might not have seen. "I married you for your money, and now that you're not worth anything anymore, I don't need you." He stood in front of her, ready to do anything to find a way to keep his family, his life, his reputation, but it was all in vain. She has already handed him the divorce papers, demanding a large compensation for all the time spent with him. He was stunned, couldn't understand how quickly his life had collapsed. There were tears, but there was no hope anymore. This divorce increased his already huge debt. Deprived of everything, his wife, the factory, and his position, John found himself at the bottom. There was no turning back in front of him. He was completely burdened with his debts, and none of those he knew could help him. Now, alone, with empty pockets, he faced a reality full of uncertainty and fear. He began to realize that everything he had been striving for, everything he had been building for years, had collapsed. He and his greed had brought him to this moment of utter ruin. False accusations, hasty decisions, and betrayal by those he trusted all played a role. When John left, I was left with a victory. Our plan worked, and now the factory was under our control. The boss was satisfied with the result, and his praise was a sweet reward for a job well done. "This guy won't get a job anywhere else," he told me, smiling. "You did a great job." At that moment, I felt that everything I had achieved made sense. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that not all victories are complete without sacrifice. He's going to find out what it really means to betray people, I thought, paying attention to every word he said. Yes, I hope he understands the consequences of his actions and understands what it's like to treat people so badly. There was something cold in this man's words, something that left a dark trail of his previous decisions, but I knew that justice would prevail sooner or later. I answered, feeling an inner sense of justice. I said, "Now you are the manager of this plant." The boss continued, his voice full of confidence. "You have the opportunity to develop the company not only for yourself, but also for employees, right?" I shook my head and said, "No, I'm not doing this for myself. I did it for my daughter, for you, and for the employees who worked hard at the factory. They deserve respect and good working conditions. I want to make sure that they are happy and feel appreciated." He looked at me with approval and smiled. "Make sure these employees are happy and taken care of." I nodded, feeling the importance of the moment. "Yes, sir, I understand." When I returned to the factory as a new manager, I was greeted with surprise and joy. My former colleagues, with whom I once worked, now looked at me as someone who could make a difference. I knew that their expectations were high, but I was ready to fulfill the promises. "Thank you all for staying and continuing to work hard," I said, standing in front of them. "I know it wasn't easy, but together we can make this factory grow and ensure that everyone gets the salary and recognition they deserve. This factory belongs to all of us, and we will make it a place we will be proud of." I saw relief and excitement in their eyes. When I spoke, I felt not only responsible, but also deeply devoted to these people. There was gratitude in their faces, which was more important to me than any success. These people had been working in the factory for many years, and I was sure they deserved something more. I was away from the factory for a while, and I noticed how much had changed. The atmosphere was different, but I was determined to make positive changes. I started by meeting with each department, listening to the workers, understanding their concerns and problems. They opened up to me, sharing their feelings about how the previous manager treated them. They complained about low wages and neglect of their needs. One of the employees said, "I have a feeling that no one cares about us." I looked into his eyes and said, "I'm here, and I care. We will work to improve the situation. Your hard work will be recognized and you will receive a well-deserved salary. Let's work together to change this factory." I spent the next few weeks working closely with the staff. I made sure that their voices were heard and their needs were met. We have implemented new policies to improve working conditions and raise wages. We have done our best to ensure that every employee is paid fairly for their work. We have also started to focus on improving the quality of our products and expanding the market to take the factory to a new level. One day I gathered everyone for a general meeting to express my gratitude. "I want to thank all of you for your dedication and hard work," I began, feeling the words fill with sincerity. "All of you played a huge role in bringing us here. Now our task is to move forward together, make this factory the best and be proud of what we do." These words were not just a speech, it was a promise that I made to each of them. We were starting a new era for our factory, and together we could achieve more than each of us alone. I said that we have achieved great success. Inspired, I continued. "The progress we have made is obvious. The factory is already seeing the benefits. Our production has increased and sales have increased. It would not have been possible without each of you." When I said these words, there was applause in response, echoing off the walls of the workshops. The employees, whose faces had recently expressed doubt and fatigue, now shone with pride. In their eyes, I saw not only satisfaction, but also gratitude, and, most importantly, sincere motivation. We were all proud of what we had done. We had gone through difficulties together, and now each of us felt that his efforts were appreciated. There was a certainty in their eyes that they were part of something bigger. Several months passed, and the factory continued to grow, flourish, becoming a strong, stable player in the market. We have expanded our activities, hired more workers, and increased production. Employees have become happier and more involved in their work. It was incredibly enjoyable to watch the factory become a place where people wanted to work. The atmosphere has changed, the old fear and tension have disappeared, giving way to enthusiasm and confidence in the future. During one of the meetings of our company, when I had enthusiastic faces in front of me, I again addressed the entire staff. I am so proud of what we have achieved together. We have changed this factory and made it a thriving business. But we're not done yet. We can achieve much more. Let's keep working hard, support each other, and make this factory the best. The response was overwhelming. The staff were full of enthusiasm, ready to move forward, believing that even greater achievements were ahead. They knew they were part of something important and special. Every effort they made, every effort they put in, bore fruit, and this was the engine that pushed us all to even greater success. The factory soon gained a reputation, becoming known for its high-quality products and excellent working conditions. We have built strong relationships with customers and suppliers, which in turn has allowed us to build long-term partnerships. Our successes have become an example for other companies, proving that treating employees well and focusing on quality is the key to long-term prosperity. Looking back, I realized how much had been done. I came to the factory in difficult, almost hopeless circumstances. But thanks to hard work, determination, and cohesion, we have created something amazing. The factory was no longer just a place of work, it became a community, a family, and a source of pride for all its participants. I was proud of what we had achieved, and I understood that our work is not only about money and profit. It was about people, about the future we had built, and about those for whom I took on this challenge. It was for my daughter's sake, for the sake of the employees, for the sake of the factory's future. Together, we have turned a struggling business into a thriving success. And at that moment, I felt that we had not just done something great, we had created something that would live and grow no matter what.